the content you're going to see today just really comes from the benefit we have at Eagles Flight of our breadth across industries and across organizations. Full respect, probably very little of the thinking is truly original. I'm a big believer there's nothing new under the sun. We're just trying to put it together and package it because we're passionate about helping really strengthen you. So just quickly, what I would love as a check-in before we dive in chat, if you could give me a couple of words on what it is you really hope to get out of today. I'll try and make sure we link and make relevant to that. So just a quick check-in, a couple of thoughts on what you really hope to get out of a session with this title. Meaningful metrics, ideas to sell impact of L&D, great. Our ability to articulate ROI, that's great. How L&D can be seen as value add to the organization. Yep, non-oriented workplace. Great, looking for different ways to show the value of L&D. Love it. So let me start with the one of the premises that Eagles Flight was founded on. If you go and talk to our founder, Phil Geltart, which I think is as true today, it sounds like in many of your organizations, although I think a lot of progress has been made. But one of the premises was Phil, when he was at Nestle, his senior leader said to him, "I don't want to pay a dime for training, but I will pay a fortune for the results of training." And that really is the pressure that we live under as L&D professionals today, right? I want to maybe quickly introduce this and get a sense of in the room where you are with your organization. So let me start with yourself. Paige is going to put a poll up here just to get a bit of a pulse check. What would you say is the primary role of, and I'm expanding it to the people function in your business, if you were to just answer it from your point of view? Is it represent the people to the organization, represent the organization to the people, impartially implement policies and initiatives, or sustain market performance through people? It's good. We'll give everybody a second. 17, 18. Oh, wow. More diversity in results than I normally get here. Okay, Paige, I think you can probably go ahead and close the poll now. And we could share results. So the majority, about half of us who responded, would say it's facilitating sustained market performance through people. There's some of us that are in the impartiality in terms of policies and initiatives. Represent the org is about a quarter, and a few people who are like, my job is represent the people. Okay, let's ask question number 2, which is really the more important one here for a second. We're going to do the poll, this second poll. If you were to go and poll your C-suite and ask them that same question, how would you think that what's your perception of their perception of the role of the people function in an organization? All right, 2 more people trying to figure out whether they think their answer is different. Okay, Paige, I think we could probably go ahead and close that. Interesting. So actually, the number of folks that said facilitate sustained market performance there went up, i.e. that you view that the C-suite puts more pressure on you than the L&D function does, which I think is fascinating, actually. So normally when I do this poll and different things, it's the other way around. So let me talk about a couple of trends and kind of try and link these in to what we're seeing here in the marketplace. But the first trend is that organizations are paying a lot more attention to the people function, especially over as we emerge from COVID. And you think about the fact that there are 5.7 million open jobs in the US right now that aren't being met, that labor markets are probably tighter than they've ever been, especially for specialty workers, whether that specialty is knowledge worker or functional worker. And there's a lot of pressure around the L&D function to really drive those results. And there's a number of disconnects that we see quite a bit. One of which I'll reference you, there's a big study actually done linking Glassdoor scores to C-suite perceptions. And one of the things they found is that on average, organizations where the C-suite had a high view of the role of the people function as a strategic function typically had an entire point higher in terms of their Glassdoor scores, and had about 30% less in terms of recruiting costs and energy that were required that goes with that. So this is no longer an academic function in most companies. So if you just think about that from a data point, how you see the function and how the organization sees the function in many places today is actually existential. The challenge is as kind of a people function, and it's fascinating. I did my MBA and I actually wrote a letter to the dean of the business school because I was so passionate about this in terms of how immature the strategy articulations were around HR and L&D as it relates to a business function. It's like, yeah, we just need better people. And okay, great, but how do we go about organizing that? And so one of the models we've used at Eagles Flight, just to anchor your thinking here, for an organization today, if you think about how do I link together a few things that are really relevant and give everybody in that C-suite a way to think about the people function. Because most CEOs and C-suites spend a degree of time around why they exist and their vision and their mission and strategy. The overwhelming majority of their time on what are the business outcomes I'm looking for, those results. Very, very, very little time on the behaviors that produce those results, and a lot of time on technology and process engineering and structure. But if you go into almost any organization and you don't have the right people doing the right things in the right place, you're never going to produce the results. So if you think about in most organizations today, you got away with that being immature 10 or 15 years ago because the pace of change around the environment you operated in, the business results that were required were relatively slow. The need to upskill and reskill was lower. And you actually had different dynamics in the labor market. And therefore, fundamentally, the behaviors piece, really, we kind of did stuff around, but fundamentally, the organization went, yeah, do training, do onboarding, do orientation, all of those things, and didn't really link it as a strategic weapon required to produce any of the results you're looking for in the business today. So if you think about it in terms of those lenses, let me talk about a couple of the trends that we're seeing, because this has been a model we've articulated and used to help L&D professionals for many, many years in our partner organizations articulate really why L&D needs to be a critical strategy, and that actually you can measure really relevant business ROI around it, but they're business metrics as opposed to these abstract metrics, and we're going to talk about that. But one of the things that we're seeing a lot in our clients today is a lot more pressure out on this big yellow circle called the reason to be. And that if you think about what's happening, and we're doing a lot of work, and over the last 5 years have seen this really, really grow pre-COVID and just go crazy post-COVID as we think about it, as the learning and development people function really being the keeper and the facilitator of helping the organization get clarity around this reason to be for their stakeholders. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The biggest one being in the challenge in the war for talent. If you think about, there's a lot of documentation and research coming out of NYU, Darden, Michigan, in terms of the significant shift in terms of new values and the value collision that is going to happen in the workplace that most researchers say we've either never seen or haven't seen in 50 or 60 years. But the emerging workforce is showing up to organizations in a way that has really never happened before, and essentially saying, listen, I have financial goals, I have wellness and psychological goals, I have social goals, and I have purpose and meaning goals. And if you can't actually help me organize to meet all four of those, I'm going to go work somewhere else. So the issue is, this pushes pressure into the leadership of an organization that probably has never even been there to really focus on this dimension with clarity and authenticity, and think about actually to attract the talent we're going to need to operate as a business. Posters on the wall, which never got the job done, and we all know that, actually today get a different job done. They communicate in authenticity in our values. And whether we like it or not, the iGen and Gen Zs that are entering the workforce have a bigger call out culture that's kind of built in, not to be negative around that, but they're way more ruthless on lack of authenticity, lack of integrity, gaps between what you espouse and what you actually live. And they have way higher standards in terms of what they expect out of a job. So most leaders are not even equipped to really think about how to translate this into an organization, let alone actually do it. And what's happening, if you think about right now in a lot of organizations, they're either sticking their head in the sand and pretending like this change is not occurring, or they're hopefully wishfully thinking that it'll just work its way out in the existing skill set. Or what's actually in a lot of cases happening is going, we need to think about how we lead in a different way and build different muscles into the organization at every single level. And it's not just about results. It's about how do we re-articulate our purpose, re-articulate our values, and translate those practically and meaningfully, those espoused beliefs, into authentic behaviors in our organization. Because otherwise the workforce that's coming in goes, no, you say that's why you exist, but you're not actually aligned to that. And if you think about organizations, and there's a ton of research I can point you to from Accenture, we'll put some of these things maybe in the follow-up deck, around the difference in recruiting pressure, retention pressure from organizations that are doing this or not doing this. It's now a cost of entry in today's environment. And in terms of, we have 15 years of Gallup data around engagement to prove that not having a leader in terms of the leadership behaviors being effective really holds us back in terms of engagement. But in the engagement data and science has really not been entirely helpful. And what's happening, I think, today in a lot of our work is where we're able to talk and link, what do you want out of your workforce? Right? Is it you just want a basic task labor contribution? Well, almost everybody today goes no. So, you know, the buzzword today around this is quiet quitting, where I just basically show up to my job and do the absolute amount of minimum. Okay, I'm getting my task labor. I do what is required to not get fired. That's quiet quitting, right? It's a great new buzzword. It's not actually new though. It's just the fruits of low engagement. At minimum, what we need out of folks is them fully applying knowledge and competence and growing in it. But if you look at what most of the competitive organizations are actually getting out of their workforce, it's I'm getting that labor, I'm getting the knowledge and competence, and I'm getting their energy, their creativity, and their care. And what's happening, if you look out broadly in the marketplace, I would observe and point you to almost any data from any of the big consultancies writing on people, McKinsey, Accenture, Deloitte. You can go and find volumes of data around this. I'm not going to summarize any of them, but they're all going to tell you this, that essentially the marketplace is polarizing, where you have leaders and laggards, and the laggards in this people area are going out of business at a level that we have not seen before, because they can't retain staff, they can't operate in the marketplace, and they can't compete. So if you're looking for the first part of the argument for why L&D is important in ROI, my argument to most leaders is before you even get to ROI, you have to get to viability. We're in the middle of a massive values collision, massive reset, and it's going to look a lot differently in terms of how leaders lead and how organizations are built to be able to operate and sustain that. Let me just pause there. Any questions, thoughts, observations before we kind of move on from kind of this last kind of trend observation around why L&D is so important in the trends we're seeing? No, everybody's sitting there going, yep, this is sounding pretty accurate. So if you think about where L&D used to be parked in the organization, and I come back to this, it used to be parked in train the people so I get the results and basically stay out of everything else. And in leading organizations today, the learning and development function is actually the facilitator of the three right buckets here in terms of really behaviorally making clear why we exist and that we actually live our values, translating results into clear frameworks that produce those. We talk about in Eagles Flight cultural and commercial outcome competency, and getting those behaviors right that produce the results that actually let us live authentically and competitively why we exist in the marketplace. And it's a power, when you can get your executives reframed around actually the power of that, it becomes as important a strategic function as finance and marketing. Because we don't actually, if you think about, I sit on a number of boards, and I'm going to give you an observation here. I've never sat on a board where anybody asks, why do we spend $50,000 a year for an audit? Even though all an audit tells you is basically what your finance guy could tell you, validated by somebody else. But people initiatives get scrutinized all the time. I'm going to argue to you that the primary thing in an audit is to make sure that your tangible assets don't get lost. In today's business, your people assets have 10 times the impact of your tangible assets in the average business. And we just did a big interview. I'll put a clip in it into the follow-up of this with Mark Kyra, who's been a longtime client of ours and sits on the board of 3G. Mark would tell you right now, he sits on half a dozen commercial boards, that there's not a board he's sitting on where he will stay on the board if people is not in the top 3 on the board's priorities. So I think as L&D professionals, this is a business strategy. The question is, how do we become the strategic function? Make sense as a question? And the reality is, I'm going to suggest to you, and what we're going to walk through today is a model that to be a strategic function, we have to operate like a strategic function. So if you go into a finance function, they have scorecards and rhythms and understand how to develop them, and they have a very, very clear focus. If you go into a marketing function like mine, we have a very, very clear set of operating annual rhythms. We've got a very, very clear scorecard that we're able to impact. And essentially, nobody asks in a company, why do I have a marketing function? And nobody asks in a company why I have a finance function. They are costs of entry in business. So the goal today is for me to kind of walk you through at a top line what we in Eagles Flight have kind of distilled out of the organizations that have accomplished this. It's really not about tips and tricks. It's about operationalizing a set of disciplines of how we operate around the people side of the business. And I'm going to call it presuming that we are a strategic function as opposed to asking whether we should be. That's really kind of that premise. So if you think about that, we're going to talk about really 5 rhythms or 5 components of a rhythm that I would say a strategic L&D function does. And some organizations, I would say, are in a rhythm where they're doing this every 6 months, some 12 months, some 18 months. I think it depends, and you kind of grow into those rhythms. But I'm going to walk you through them because I think there is, if I take, it really depends a lot on organizational size. We do works with global Fortune 100 banks, and we do work with mid-market construction companies and everywhere in between. And the answer is the rhythm should be driven by the needs of the business, not some abstract consultant best practice. So we're going to talk mainly about principles, and then I'm going to try and help wrestle through how do we help apply those principles. And that's really where our meat is for the rest of today. Make sense so far? Great. So let's talk about define current reality. If you think about being a strategic function, you need to think about really 2 things. Where are you in your stage of maturity, your development? And this is not as a L&D function. This is as an organization at learning and development. And I'm going to give you this as kind of an impassioned plea. The CFO does not think that only finance is responsible for revenue, expenses, and profit. They are the facilitator of the organization, making sure we get enough revenue and manage our expenses to get profit. In the same way, the L&D function can't allow itself to become the people who have to own everything. Learning is fundamentally a discipline that everybody in the organization does, and development is a discipline that everybody in the organization does. So if you think about defining reality, you've got to think about this through the lens of where is my organization at? And what are the gaps, barriers, and enablers? So I'm going to talk about those in terms of step one. Let me start, and there's a bazillion maturity models out there around L&D. My quick observation to most of you is most of them are written to sell you software. So most learning and development maturity models and thought leadership was developed by consultancies like ours, and primarily because we've been in a 15-year learning tech boom, they're really designed to help you mature your learning and development technology stack. That is not the same as the organization being more effective at learning and development. It's not that they're unhelpful, there's some useful ones out there. But if you think about what are you trying to do as a learning and development professional? First of all, you have to get clarity. What are we learning and what does development look like in terms of why we exist, how we create value, and what our values and culture are? Then we've got to translate that into constant competence, where we're consistently achieving our commercial and cultural outcomes. And then third, we want to translate that into competitiveness. So clarity, competence, competitiveness. So when we go into a lot of organizations, the CEO has read 15 things and they're like, I need you to make my people really, really a source of competitive advantage in the marketplace. No problem. But you go in and you do a discovery, they don't know why you exist really, in terms of, they don't really understand how the various functions create value, and they don't understand what culture and values you want to actually demonstrably live, which is your brand, both for your customer and your talent. So you can't possibly be competitive until you have clarity and then competence. And then if you think about this as an L&D function in terms of maturity, there's stable for the present, and the present is always a bit of an amorphous question. And I'm going to use a buzzword that's really, really big in a lot of organizations right now, but I think is really important. It comes out of the work of Nassim Taleb, which is that we're anti-fragile for the future. If you think about Taleb talks about a spectrum of fragile, robust, and anti-fragile as a way to kind of quickly understand this. We have all realized in the last 2 years how fragile we are as an organization, right? One of the great things around the pandemic is that kind of level of disruption actually shows where we're really fragile. So if you think about his basic premise is, I can't predict the future, but I know how fragile or not fragile I am in terms of future events. The way great organizations think about their people and their talent strategy is I can't fully predict what competencies are going to be required, but do I know what's not going to change and where we must continue to adapt? Do I have the cultural competence and trust required to empower that kind of adaptability across the organization? And that ultimately, the kind of final level, I would argue, of ultimate competitiveness. And if you look at the organizations, like those top quartile organizations, I'll point to an Amazon right now, which has its flaws, I'm sure, in its culture, but what they're able to do is have a lot of positive adaptation and innovation that occurs consistently, aligned with their core identity in the field. So if you think about that as a maturity model, the first question to ask yourself as you think about putting together any strategy is, where am I? Because if you're at stage 1 and you go into the boardroom, start talking about stage 6, it's not going to make sense. So one of the disciplines when we work with C-suite teams to try and get them thinking about their culture is really getting them to soberly self-reflect on, where are we actually at on this journey? Do we need to stabilize our competency for the present, or can we actually reach out and start to work on some of these capacities for the future? Because it's going to dramatically change how I prioritize things and how I interpret data. And let me talk to you about data here. You've all, I'm sure, heard the parable of the plumber. I'm sure you have it. So I used to run an organization. I used to be a chief operating officer, and we were a resort organization. We had water slides and lots of cabins, and water was a really big deal, and water pressure was a really big deal. And one of the things that came out of there, that it's actually how I use with my team there to help them understand big data versus our data, right? Which was, if you think about, you're going out and you have a water pressure problem, which the analogy here for this parable is water pressure equivalent to talent. So I go out and the boss, me or whoever, says, you need to solve this water pressure problem. You would never call a plumber and say, on average, when organizations struggle with water pressure, what is it they do? That's maybe a meaningful big data point to help me kind of vaguely understand where I should start looking. Should I start looking at tanks? Should I start looking at line quality? Should I start looking at reservoirs? But you would never ask a plumber, on average, what did your last 10 clients do to get better water pressure? You would bring the plumber in and you would say, okay, look at our design, look at what's working and not working. And what I need is not to buy things that may work for other companies, but what I actually need is really good insights in how I get water pressure in my organization. So on average, I might ask the plumber, what do you generally do and how much does it generally cost, just to get a sense when I'm early in those decision stages. But before a plumber can get me better water pressure, they need to understand my specific problem, my specific design of my plumbing, and find out exactly what is reducing water pressure. If you think like that, the issue here is big data is helpful to tell you where to look in general, but you really need your data to help you be insightful. So, and one of the absolute best sources of data is your people. They know, I guarantee you, when we go into organizations, whether it's to help with a very specific thing or a general culture thing or leadership, when we go into the field and you find the right people at the right levels in the organization, they know where all the gaps are and can describe them more articulately than anybody else in the organization. They understand what all the barriers are to being able to close those gaps, and they see the enablers as well as the barriers, meaning the things either in our culture or in our operating norms that we can lean into to be able to solve those gaps. Here's the problem. We don't generally have really good tools to be able to collect that data, right? Especially if you're a reduced L&D department, you're one or two people, it's not realistic. How do I go and be able to scale getting that kind of data and insight? So there are tools out there. We have a few of them. There's a number of organizations. This is not a sales pitch for Eagles Flight Tools, but if you think about this, there's kind of 3 criteria, whether you build it yourself or use a consultant to do it, getting those insights in terms of how in your stage of maturity and what your actual gaps are for performance, what the barriers are to closing those gaps, and what the enablers are to your in. The first is you need to go to your folks with feed forward and get feed forward information. Most focus groups and surveys are about complaining about the past. So really great data collection starts with articulating your desired or aspirational future state and getting your organization to tell you how to get there. This is an example of one of our tools on the left here that we would use. We would put in there and say, okay, we just did this for an organization that said, our goal is to have a high performance culture as designed by these 5 things. Tell us where the gaps are, what the barriers to closing those gaps are, and what the enablers are in the culture, how we operate collaboratively in teams, what the leaders are not doing in terms of impact, and also what our individual employees aren't doing. And it's a scalable process. There's a lot of digital tools out there that enable you to do this. Social learning tools. There's a partner of ours called Housebase that we use, where you could facilitate this process for hundreds or thousands of people if necessary, your whole organization. They actually did a gathering thing for the country of Denmark around how to reopen schools. And one of the great things around technology is it's allowing us to get a lot more of that focused data so that our business, when we get to these business cases later that we want to build, it's not what, most executives I know today are pretty skeptical of, what Gallup or Deloitte or any of these big consultancies tell them in general. What's my problem and how it's going to be fixed? So you need feed forward information through a scalable process that minimizes groupthink, and you need to engage the change ambassadors across functions and levels so that you're getting the half of the organization involved that's actually going to help you implement whatever it is you find. So if you think about a kind of a organizational curve, you're going to have 10% of people that love you and care deeply about you and are great and are champions for your organization. You're going to have 10% of people that are hurt, frustrated, or disillusioned and are going to just complain and tell you you're not great anyway and probably need to go. The goal of this process is to figure out the middle. It's the 50% in the middle that if you move, changes the game. Make sense? So if you think about what great learning and development organizations do, they soberly assess their stage of maturity, and they're constantly trying to get this kind of field data from their people around that reason to be aspirational future state. Because it then anchors my view in what needs to happen. Let me just pause there. And by the way, I'm happy to take questions as we go in the chat. So feel free to put them in if there's something that's on your mind, and I'll try and pause between kind of content chunks to answer them and kind of interact. So feel free to do that. So if you think about that really being the anchor for the organization on how to get clarity around your reason to be, how to link reason to be and results, and do it in a way that's really going to solve that core challenge in your talent strategy today, which is how do I authentically live my purpose and values and the value I create in a way that's going to attract talent. That discipline is constantly at the front end of the learning of the top tier learning and development functions. And if you think about that, when you do that well, you create either virtuous cycles, and if you don't do it, you're creating unvirtuous cycles, where I'm then better able to clarify business outcomes and results, which are going to require behavior change, which may require different tools and technology and process. And those new technologies then get adopted because the behavior case was linked to it, and the technology and the behaviors produce results. So fundamentally, that cycle requires real local plumbing data and knowledge, as opposed to generic out there, here's what 70% of organizations do, and it leads to great results. And I would say to you that the leading L&D functions, that is the number one differentiator I would see. They're not in love, they use a lot of big data, but they're not in love with big data. They're really trying to figure out, what do I need here? And what are my people telling me are the gaps, the barriers, enablers, once they're clear on what the future is. And when we, by the way, as a quick war story, when we did that high performance culture thing, you know what the first thing that came out was that they had lots of documentation around their purpose. They had lots of documentation around their values. They even had a whole competency framework. And that 75% of that middle group said, yeah, the why is not clear in the field, the values are not authentically lived, and the competencies are 5 years old. So we're being told and reinforced things that, given what you're telling us we want to do, they don't actually resonate and they're not going to produce the results. Humongously valuable to redesign that initiative. Only way you get that is out of the people. Make sense so far? How do we get executives reframed around true people competency and behaviors? Great question. I got a couple of thoughts for you in the final presentation. So Hattie, did I pronounce that correctly? Hopefully, Hattie, if I haven't answered that, yes. Thank you. If I haven't answered that by the time we get to place your bets, poke me again and I'll try and re-answer it. Because what I'm going to suggest to you is that the way you're going to get them is actually utilizing this process fundamentally. All right. The next thing is inventory your bets. If you think about in any function in an organization, so I'll use me, I run a marketing function right now. There are 50 things that we should be doing that abstractly at some point, hopefully will pay back. But I can't execute 50 things. I can maybe with our team today execute 3 to 4 things a quarter and 1 or 2 big things a year. So the challenge is, how do I go about and think about what are all of the things that could happen? So some of you will find this chart helpful in terms of all that's in it. Some of it, just worry about the top. So I deliberately didn't design it because this is an example of something that I've recently done with a chief learning officer to help them try and get their arms around all of the things, right? Okay, good. I've got my stage of maturity. I've got all this data. And now before I go into action, I've got to think about how do I inventory all the things I could do that are bets that'll change the game? And then how do I prioritize them? So you have to start by inventorying them. And what I'm going to suggest to you is, especially as you grow in your L&D career, the data is only going to take you so far. At some point, you have to come to a place of belief around what's going on that's supported by quantitative evidence, the data, and qualitative evidence, what you're hearing, and start to figure out how to translate it into a business impact. So if you think about the way I often recommend for a CLO to inventory their bets, start with your belief, your hypothesis. Think about, if that hypothesis was true, what would I do? Then you can start to work about, okay, well, how would I actually define that bet, that doing that? What's the evidence that I'm seeing that's supporting this as a real issue? And I talk about real evidence or hard evidence and qualitative evidence, things that are in my experience. And then I need some kind of straw man around the business impact. And then I'm going to talk you through a process of how to validate that. But this is at the top line to be able to view the mountaintop and see the big picture as an L&D person. And it's fascinating to me. I meet with a lot of senior executives and learning executives that this sheet of paper for them is actually the number one tool for them to get their head around, wow, there are a lot of things that actually, when I look at your belief, I actually agree with that belief. And I didn't really think about there was something I could do about that belief. And man, I now see a way to translate that into tangible business impact. So let me walk this through with a bit of a story here in a second for you. Because I know at the inventory bets level, it's a little bit abstract. But if you think about one of these lines, I'm going to walk you through positive safety culture transformation in a second on the next slide, so you can get your head around how do you actually go and fill out this chart. But fundamentally, before you can do the work of actually drilling down to a business case, presenting it, getting them on board, you actually have to be able to go to the mountaintop, step back and inventory all the things that you could do and beliefs. And what I find is this is incredibly helpful for the C-suite, because when you go in there, you're actually not debating whether the beliefs are true. You're debating the relative impact on acting on that belief on the business. And when that conversation switches, you get a lot of attention and a lot of executive engagement on, wow, now that I actually agree with you, our culture is too brittle and unempowering, primarily around safety and risk management as an organization. And yeah, now that I think about it, if we did that and we drove that down to the front line, that would change the game. I just happen to use that one because I happen to run the safety practice at Eagles Flight. It's the easiest one for me to populate with fun stories. But let me give you a different example that's not me. We do a lot of work with a couple of banks where the bottom line, employees lack the mental health and working skills to consistently thrive at work, period. I think if you went into most C-suites today, they would go, I agree with that belief. And I didn't really think about the idea that if we had a wellness program and life and working skills, that, man, and I've defined it that way, and I've got the evidence, and I can qualitatively point to the discussions that are happening. And if we made a 25% reduction in lost days, that saves us just direct in terms of part-time or whatever, 400,000. And think about the, man, I can now actually get the C-suite's head around this and get their valuable input. So when I get to the presentation, really, I've socialized 50% of what I need to talk about. Thank you, Joseph. Really appreciate the feedback around the one-pager. And you're going to get all of this stuff, by the way, as a follow-up. I encourage you, adapt it, make it your own. It's just a really helpful tool for me to inventory bets and think about as a strategic function head. Man, there's a lot to do, and I can't do all of this. So now I got to think about, all right, I've inventoried my bets. How do I prioritize in top line? So let me give you some theory, a story, and practice. Theoretically, I would organize them. I'm a visual person, so I like to visualize all of this stuff. I would visualize them into something that looks like this. And I've just kind of pre-populated this. Top line, what's the level of investment? Total amount of time, money, and energy required to guarantee success. And that last line is really important, because if I'm going to go ask the C-suite for time, money, and energy, most CFOs I know would say to you, and certainly I do a fair amount of investing and work in venture capital as well, so I'm kind of have a bias here. And if you go and watch the documentary, as a side note, it's the best way to illustrate this bias. Bill Gates, there's a great scene where they go in and they ask him for $50 million. And he says, yeah, but given your data, aren't you going to need $200 million to really solve the problem? And they go, yeah, why aren't you asking? I would much rather spend $200 million and get the outcome than throw away 50 million crying. And most senior people and boards think like that, because if it's that important, and if you've inventoried your bets correctly, you want to go and ask for the time and money and energy required to guarantee success, because otherwise the business doesn't get the benefit. So don't ask for 10, knowing it's going to cost 40, because you're going to end up in trouble, you're going to frustrate them, and you're going to lose credibility as a strategic function. Some of the, I'm in marketing, half of my conversations, I'll just use with Eagles Flight, I go, giving me $50,000 for that is a waste of time. I can't get you to the outcome for anything less than $500,000. So if we're not going to spend $500,000, don't spend 50,000, because we'll feel better about doing nothing. That's not how a strategic function thinks. So if you think about level of investment, that's a really important distinction. The second one is time to impact. Amount of time required for the business to realize the benefit, not the amount of time it takes you to do the work. I'm the CFO. I don't really care about how much time it takes you to do the work. I care how long is it going to take before the business feels the benefit. And the size of the bubble then tells me, give or take relative to the other things, how big an impact is this? Okay? Because this chart actually lets me do a couple of things. And it's kind of obvious when you visualize it this way. Low investment things that have a quick impact on an immediate or present problem, I can just go and do. I don't need to get people aligned. Get them up, just implement it, do it. Get it off the list, don't debate it, don't talk about it. Figure out a way to cleverly get it done. Higher investment things that take a long time to pay back, that are about the present, are a waste of time, because the business isn't going to feel the benefit anyway in the time I need it. So I'm going to have to deal with another strategy. Okay. Low investment things for the future, same thing, get them done. Things that are primarily about the future, I have a timing question, because I can't do everything. And now I've got these other bubbles that I got to figure out what to do with. Because almost by definition, I'm not going to be able to do them on the existing time, money, and energy I have. And therefore, I have to go ask for it. So this chart now, if you think about your inventory of your bets and your ability to articulate it this clearly, allows me to clear the noise for my executives and let them really focus on the rationale for doing or not doing at a top line level. Okay. So I have a great benefit here as the presenter, which is I can make all of this stuff sound easy, and we do it all the time. So let me kind of have theory collide with reality here in a story and get a little bit practical in terms of, okay, Chris, that's great, but how do you get the data for the chart, and how do you move this stuff to a point of clarity and conviction? So let me give you a simple 6-step process, and I'm going to apply it to a safety client. The first is this, and this is my #1 piece of advice. Hear the rant from the line executive. Not necessarily the CEO, not necessarily the CFO, the line executive who has to translate whatever the learning and development problem is into a result. And if you build relationships with the line executives, and I use the word rant very, very deliberately, because 90% of them don't have time to think through the problem in a level of clarity to articulate it and tell you what they're just going to rant at you, right? Then create a shared hypothesis with that person, then go figure out your data. Then you got to do some root cause second order thinking to break it down, build the scorecard, and validate the payback mechanics around that with the CFO. So let me tell you a story of, I can only speak from my experience where we did this with a client. And we got brought in to deal with a safety problem, senior person, and essentially this guy was at the end of his rope. So he was a president of a division. He'd had safety on their card for 3 years. And he basically brought us in and said, listen, I have a huge problem with safety. It is costing me millions of dollars a year in lost time injuries. My labor relations is getting beat up at these 8 sites because the union's beating me up. The line managers are this. We're too contained in terms of our process, so it takes us forever to implement it. Essentially, he ranted for 30 or 40 minutes. And we came back to him and said, okay, great, I understand that. So let me just make sure I understood your rant and let me translate it into a hypothesis, which is essentially if we could get all the employees really owning proactively a safety outcome and doing it in a way where they felt that feedback was a gift and that we were able to, they were empowered to make common sense things and speak up. And we had the line managers trained to really, really support that effort. And we got EHS on board where they realized that their primary job was actually supporting the employees getting put. Then essentially you'd save like 15 or 20, because we'll cut your number in half in terms of compliance costs and lost time injuries, 15 or 20 million a year. These labor relations issues would go away or be significantly reduced. And you'd probably get higher level of engagement with your folks, as well as you get to stand up and use safety as a way to really demonstrate care. That's your hypothesis. Wow. Yes, if you could do that, I will move mountains. You can have my team. I'll find you the money, because it was about his problem. It wasn't about what abstract consultants tell you around a positive safety culture, even though you need all of those data. It was about his problem, and he knew the problem. He knew what it was costing him in terms of hard dollars, soft dollars, friction in the system. And then he needed us to go away and essentially get that data, qualitative and quantitative, to validate that hypothesis. And when we went to the field, if you think about good scientific method, we actually tried to prove it wrong. We tried to find evidence that actually no, employees already do really care about safety and managers equip it. And we've actually modified the hypothesis, because that second order thinking is really, okay, well, how are we going to sustain this? What's it gonna, how are we gonna not fall off a cliff in 9 months when these things go away? And out of that, we built a scorecard, because we're now in the results thing. It's great, we're part of their values was safety, and essentially we had business metrics that had leading indicators of what would it look like if it was really happening, that had leadership behaviors, that had employee behaviors around it. And now if you think about this as a way to action that, as an example, I got it. Great, so you're gonna reduce my lost time injuries and my injuries and my compliance costs, and you're gonna have my labor relations go down. And we also found, by the way, that there was correlation to quality and trust and engagement and absenteeism, all of which we could quantify using other functions in the business. We didn't have to do the work. We just, if that was the senior guy's thesis, you go in and basically, okay, that's the metrics you want. It's gonna help you with your reason to be, it's gonna help you with all these things, but that's our payback case. Because when you have to go to the CFO, my universal saying is the money is in the metrics. Give them the metrics, the money's easy. No metrics, no money. That's just most senior finance people, that's the way they think. Whether we agree with it or not, it's practically how we got to think for our audience. The problem is all of those business metrics are lagging indicators. You're not going to see the benefit for 9 to 12 to 18 months. And when you see the benefit, they're still lagging indicators and we don't know whether we've sustained it. So we need leading indicators that give us that immediate adrenaline hit that we all want, which is like, oh, wow, this works. So tap-in ideas are going up. First aid reporting is going up. Near-miss reporting is going up. On our safety culture pulse check, we went from a 5.7 out of 7 to from a 3. And in terms of Enabling better outcomes. When we go to the line managers, they gave us a 6.6 out of 7. So we're able to translate what we're accountable for, what the line manager is accountable for, and what the employee is accountable for into a way, and this is the number one thing when you go and do this as an L&D person, that you have to manage, which is I cannot be accountable for all of this. I am the facilitator and supporter of all of this, but the line manager has to be accountable, and therefore his boss has to be accountable for making sure whether it happens or not. So it gives me actually a way to translate that thesis into a shared accountability for the initiative. Absolutely critical. Make sense so far? Now I go to the CFO with this card, and the CFO looks at me and goes, okay, great, I got it. Here's 27 questions and 4 pieces of input, but I fundamentally understand why this is a strategic initiative that will deliver business outcomes, as well as help with my reason to be, as well as help with that. And you can, this is a safety one. With this scorecard and what I'm going to show you next, which is a Gantt chart of how it's going to roll out over time, is practically how you get a C-suite on board. They can't process more information than this. And a model of how it works. I'm going to give you these tips in a second. But if you think about as a strategic function now, this is an initiative scorecard. So if you think about, this is very specific to a specific initiative. It's how I translate one of those bubbles into something that's compelling. I also suggest you have an overall learning and development scorecard, and I don't put one up because they need to be really specific to your business. I'm not a big fan of generic scorecards, but you need both. But this then allows you, when we get to step 5, to manage the executives, because once you get the money and support, the hardest thing is keeping them focused on supporting it with alignment. So if you don't manage the process this way, you might sell them, and you're going to sell them on a way that's going to set you up for failure. And the reason is because you're on the hook for everything without them owning the piece and making the people that have to own the piece own what they've got to do. As the head of L&D, I can't visibly lead safety in the organization. The CEO has to do that, or the chief operating officer. So they got to understand it, and they got to understand why they got to find you an hour every other week in their calendar to shoot a video or write a memo or do whatever it is. Make sense so far? So once you think about translating it into this framework, and then the biggest deal here is the money is actually going to be their second concern. Having done this a lot of time, their biggest concern is how much time does it take from who? And this is where, if you think about building your initiative roadmap this way, things like this is a relatively simple Gantt chart for a single topic. This is a more complicated culture transformation overview, but it lets me get the head around, okay, this is going to take time, right? Some of these transformational initiatives take time. They take resources. They have moving parts. And on some of them, we also had a column here. This is just who is actually doing this stuff and how much time does it take? Because almost invariably, in my experience, when senior people choose not to move forward on this, the money is the second reason. The biggest reason is you are actually competing for time before you compete for money. Everybody wants learning and development to happen in 30 minutes between my morning meeting and my afternoon meeting. And that's fine if you're learning out how to work the new who's a what's it gizmo in your thingamabobber. But if you're trying to figure out how to be a better presenter or a better leader, or how to re-engage a workforce that's going through a hybrid disruption and is got mental health issues, you're not doing that in a 30-minute webinar. Learning takes time. You got to sell the time before you sell the money. Make sense so far? Okay, I got to watch my time here, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I do want to leave time for Q&A at the end. Now I've got to place my bets. Fundamentally, I am not the person that places my bet. I got to go and get alignment from the executives and whoever the executives are, which is always an amorphous thing. So there are 7 essentials for presenting your initiative I'm going to give you. The first is know the decision matrix. It is very, very, very rare today that a decision gets made by a single senior executive. Inevitably, it is a matrix, and people on there have either a facilitator or ultimate decision role, a gatekeeper role, an influencer role. But I would guess on anything significant you want to do, you're probably looking between 5 to 10 people who are going to have some kind of role in that decision-making process. You need to know who they are, and you need to know what they think about success. Point number 2. Once you have that, you're going to have a bunch of noise. The only way to cut through noise is a clear and compelling why we are doing this, which is back to the inventory of bets charts. You're competing for time and money. They only spend those things on compelling whys. That has to have a business case intellectually and an emotional case in terms of what I believe about the future. I'm going to give you 4 key visuals that you're going to want to do, because typically, if you think about this as an organizing framework for this, I cannot say yes to something I don't understand. And I can't read 200 pages to understand it. And most of the time, the 200 pages don't help me understand it. So I need 4 things: a model of how it works, a scorecard of how we're going to measure success, a Gantt chart to show me and help me understand timing, and the money laid out, how much for what. Fundamentally, if you're anything you go and present or ask for is more complicated than that, you will get what this is. I also do a lot of sales training. 53% of B2B decisions today end in no decision. As a salesperson and as a learning and development person, I'm just going to tell you right now, almost always your biggest enemy is complexity. Because I can't say yes to something I don't understand, even if in my gut I really believe in it. So you got to help me understand it. And you got to make it simple enough I can process it. Explain how you will de-risk failure. As much as we all like to say we're visionaries who are rationally motivated to buy on the benefits in the case, I also avoid failure, right? If you're a senior person, you have thought a lot about why things, as soon as you tell me why it's going to work, I think of 7 reasons why it's going to fail. I'm going to show you some stuff in there. Anticipate questions and objections, and options are great, but recommendations win the day. So let me talk to you about models, because I've shown you a scorecard and I've shown you Gantt chart for timing. Let me talk to you about models for a second. Models are a simple visual way for you. Your brain stores fundamentally information 2 ways: pictures, see a model, and stories. Magic as a presenter is where I have a story and a picture. It's really, we teach a course on it, but there's, powerful storytelling and communication 2-day workshop in 30 seconds. So if I can give you a senior person a picture and I can tell them a story, they will understand it emotionally and intellectually, right? And if you ever do the science on cognition, we're all motivated reasoners. So you got to engage my emotion and my intellect and help me understand it. So these are examples of models we use with executives that I got it. Okay, good. The values translate into those things, translate into that, which gets me the results. Now you got to explain that, but I can intellectually understand. Okay. All of this you're getting, gang, and I know I'm going fast. So, but I want time for Q&A. De-risking. Let me show you, this is a sales slide, but if you think about a culture transformation, I tell them the reasons why a behavior change approach works, right? We create conviction, we provide pragmatic knowledge, we build skill, and we form habits that produce the results. Because everybody knows one behavior once doesn't produce a result. It's my habits that produce a result. And forming habits takes a lot of time and energy. So why do these things fail? Well, there's 12 reasons. Let me give you this as a they look at that list and go, if you can write the list and overcome those 12 things, you are now credible to me. Because I know there's a bunch of, we've all seen initiatives that fail. So we'll give you this list. By the way, this is why a transformational learning initiative fails. And there's a lot of field research and experience behind it, but I don't need to know all the research. I agree with all 12 of those things. If you give me a plan to address those, and I believe in the benefit, we're a long way to you having me on board. Make sense so far? Okay, last thought, and then I'm going to wrap with this. The reason you have to sell your initiative that way is you are going to need their active and ongoing support. Nothing that changes in an organization changes without the leaders. The body follows the head. So and we use a saying at Eagles Flight, model, coach, require. If the senior people don't model, coach, and require it, their people won't model, coach, and require it, which means their people won't model, coach, and require it, which means it won't get implemented at the front lines. So you have to keep them involved. When I'm involved in designing the process and you've gotten my input and you've gotten my thinking, now you just have to make that easy for me. There are two ways you make it easy. Give me a comprehensible scorecard with active monitoring, because I know as a senior person, by the way, I know nothing ever goes to plan. If they've been in the job long enough, right, you can pick your analogy, but no plan survives first contact as it was written. I got to actively monitor this thing and manage the leading indicators and adapt and deal gaps, and factories are going to get shut down or COVID's going to occur or whatever it is. So I've got to get the business outcome. Therefore, you need me to support you. So we use a very, very, very simple process. Keep them involved throughout the whole initiative design. Get them to agree to the scorecard with the targets. I didn't set the targets. You did, gang. We committed to these together, as opposed to me as the learning and development person signed up to something that you didn't think was possible, but you're more than happy to hold me accountable to. And now quarterly, I need 2 hours with you. Just once a quarter, review the scorecard and the pulse check data, whatever it is, leading indicators. And I need to facilitate this. You doing something, following up, and providing us feedback. We're managing this together. And if you think about that simple process done quarterly with data, and then following up with them to give them additional coaching and support as required, you will de-risk the biggest reason you're not going to get money the next time, which is the initiative fail. And if you think about, kind of wrapping with this thought, teams that consistently act upon that 5-step process, they migrate from not being perceived as a strategic function to being perceived as a strategic function, because I keep solving strategic business problems. Fundamentally, that it becoming a strategic function and having L&D be integrated in a business strategy, where ultimately you get to the place where the C-suite can't meet without having people on the agenda, and the board can't meet without having people on the agenda, is that every time we follow this process, we solve the most pressing strategic problems in the business, and therefore we become more mature. And ultimately, if we get to the point where we're in that kind of level 6 maturity, now I'm constantly in this cycle where the organization tells me what it needs. It knows it requires resources and time and energy to get there, and we're able to adapt. We're able to innovate. We're able to learn together. And I move from having to produce miracles with no money to being the facilitator of the business, understanding the power of my personal learning and development journey translating into my competitiveness collectively in terms of culture and commercial outcomes, so that we build a winning organization.